Agriculture uses 45% of all habitable land on the planet. 80% of that is used by animal ag, so almost 4 times the size of the United States land mass is devoted to animal agriculture. Thank you, and I just wanted to start by thanking the organizers and all the volunteers for creating such a beautiful space. This is my first time at this conference, but I've known about it for loads of years. And thanks to you for everything that you're doing, and thanks for delaying your dinner gratification for just a little bit longer, and I appreciate that. I'll just start by saying a few things about me, and then get into the presentation. So yeah, I co-direct the Center for Human Animal Studies at Edge Hill University, which is like a bunch of mostly vegan academics, and also I think we have about 6 PhD students, all doing projects related to veganism. If you're at a stage in your life where you're thinking that you want to do a PhD, then look us up. There's a website there. I also co-founder of the European Association for Critical Animal Studies, and we hold a conference all in different places around Europe every 2 years, hopefully next year in Berlin. And if you don't know what critical animal studies is, I imagine most of you do. It's trying to combine scholarly work with activism, so trying to kind of go beyond that divide between theory and practice. I've also got a kind of voluntary position with the Vegan Society, where I chair their research advisory committee, and we had a little one-day conference with them 2 days ago. Okay, right. So I guess this is the work that I've been doing the last 15 years or so. Some of the key, it's not all the work, but it's, I guess, the key major things. Had my first book out in 2010, Animals as Biotech, Critical Animal Studies, Ethics and Sustainability. And then I co-edited this volume with Nick Taylor in 2014, The Rise of Critical Animal Studies. I have a kind of secondary aim for this talk to occasionally big up other people in the field of critical animal studies. If you've not heard of them, to kind of check out their work. So Nick Taylor is a great sociologist based over in New Zealand. I've just had this book out a few months ago, The Climate Crisis and Other Animals. It won't surprise you that that's basically what I'm talking from today. So this one here. And in a couple of months, this new book, Violence and Harm in the Animal Industrial Complex, that's another edited volume that's coming out, and it's got some chapters by great people like Jason Hanan, who you might know as the author of the Meat-Splaining book, and other great people like Nuria Almiron, who's based in Barcelona, another great person you should check out. And there's a few of my, I guess, more prominent journal articles that I've published over the years, reflecting my interests in intersectionality and ecofeminism, in theorizing the animal industrial complex, in thinking about vegan transition, theorizing vegan transition as well. So it's a bit of a snapshot. In terms of my most recent book, this is the breakdown in terms of chapters. Can't talk about it all today because it's too long, but I'm going to focus on little fragments of it from various chapters, such as chapters 3 and 4 mostly, actually. But you can get a sense of the book just by looking at the chapter headings there. Okay. You can ask me about other parts of the book later if you want, or you can grab me later. Okay, right, to the talk. So the outline, I want to obviously encourage us to think critically about the discourse, the framing of climate justice. I then want to ask, well, what is the climate crisis a crisis of? How do we even understand that, both historically and in the present day? I want to problematize anthropocentric ideology, like all of us, and I want to stress the place of human-animal relations in the climate crisis, so that will be actually quite a big chunk of my talk today. And ask, what do we offer the climate justice movement, and maybe what can we learn from it too? And then obviously just finish with some summarizing thoughts. Okay. So, climate justice, as currently understood, is something of a flawed concept, I think, captured quite well in that placard. Climate justice equals human justice, kind of perfectly encapsulates what I think is the kind of anthropocentrism within the concept. It is progressive, of course, in certain respects. It is, for example, recognizing intersections between the climate crisis and social inequalities of class, gender, and ethnicity, both in theorizing its emergence and understanding how its impacts are playing out. So it recognizes the climate crisis as a social and political problem as well as an environmental one. So that's great. But it assumes justice and injustice as experiences only applicable to the human. And it uses an anthropocentric framing to try and address a crisis that is partly caused by anthropocentrism, just like a few other concepts we might be familiar with. So things like sustainability, which I did use that in the title of my first book. I don't use it so much anymore because it's just so kind of instrumental and so anthropocentric. And then also things like just transition is often used in quite a human-centered way as well. So kind of making our way through the discursive terrain of climate politics, unfortunately, means encountering lots of ideas which are quite human-centered. So I ask in the book, in the first couple of chapters actually, what is the climate crisis a crisis of? And I do a lot of detailed historical work and citing lots of good people on this. Clearly, it's become quite established, quite accepted, at least within critical theory, that the climate crisis is a crisis of capitalism. But that then begs the question, well, how do we understand capitalism? How do we conceptualize what capitalism is? In the book, I'm influenced by folks like Jason Moore and Nancy Fraser, who are really good eco-socialist theorists, but not vegans. So you kind of take what you can, and they understand capitalism as not only an economic system. So I think that's like a really important thing that they stress. And they also reject the idea of the idea that we're living in the Anthropocene. They prefer the term the Capitalocene, and I agree with them that it's a term that is more attuned to the politics of the climate crisis, whereas the Anthropocene kind of just assumes that everybody is equally responsible for what's happening. Okay. And just to quote myself, which is a bit weird, but from page 16 of the book, the Capitalocene framework allows us to see the climate crisis not only as a crisis of capitalism, but also as a crisis of patriarchy, colonialism, and anthropocentrism, relations of power integral to capitalist accumulation strategies, which have prefaced the rise in greenhouse gas emissions. Okay, so you can see that we're not just thinking of capitalism in a narrow economic sense. Okay, so yeah, this contributes to an intersectional approach toward the climate crisis, in which we see it as emerging through a capitalism inherently gendered, colonialist, and anthropocentric. Okay, and that's not to say that these things didn't in some ways pre-exist capitalism as well. Okay. Okay. So we are unlikely to succeed in addressing it unless we tackle its underlying power relations. And that's exactly what we're not doing. We're kind of putting the focus on trying to tackle emissions, but we're not looking at the political relations behind the production of those emissions. Okay. Okay, a little bit more on anthropocentrism, which is kind of stuff that you'll know, but or some of it anyway, the stuff that we need to be saying to the climate justice movement. Okay, so most literally, in its very basic definition, it means human-centeredness, but folks in critical animal studies have come up with slightly more detailed definitions. So just to big up another critical animal studies person, the US philosopher Matthew Calarco, please do check out his work. Another thing about CAS scholars is we try to write accessibly, so yeah, please do check out his work. He says that he defines anthropocentrism, and there's actually a longer definition that he's got, but this is just a part of it. The view that human beings, in opposition to animals and other non-human beings, are of supreme importance in ethical, political, legal, and existential matters. Okay. And this is embedded within and exacerbated through the development of capitalism. Okay. And societies need to reflect on this and reject it. Obviously, that's our view. Ironically, it is in our own interest to reject anthropocentrism. Okay. And I just wanted to add it in the sense that it's embedded within and exacerbated through the development of capitalism. It's not only in the obvious infrastructures of the food system, but also in energy and transport too. These also lead to a lot of loss of life of non-human animals. Okay. a little bit more on anthropocentrism. So yeah, it's shaping our dominant cultural institutions within our education system, law, media, politics. And regarding the climate crisis, it's shaping accounts of the emergence of the climate crisis with an over-focus on fossil fuels. Food system tends to get marginalized. So obviously, lots of us here are trying to contest that. Accounts of the impacts of the climate crisis tend to have an over-focus on how it's impacting human beings. Not always, but that's present too. And accounts of strategies for change tend to focus on energy system transition over food system transition. Okay. So what I do in the book is to really underline the place of human-animal relations in the climate crisis. So in contrast to this anthropocentric framing, a significant focus of my book is to argue for the role of human-animal relations in the following three areas. The emergence of the climate crisis, so how anthropocentric human-animal relations shaped both the land use changes and greenhouse gas emissions that are such a part of the overlapping climate and biodiversity crises, how these crises play out in terms of their impacts upon other species, those disastrous impacts that are, well, I'll come to a bit later, and how human-animal relations are becoming more instrumental because of this. And thirdly, exploring the evidence base for the radical transformation of human-animal relations as one inescapable approach to tackling these crises. And so in doing that, I argue for both a decommodification of human-animal relations, but also of the food system itself. So that's kind of my eco-socialist side coming out on that point. Okay. So I'm against the idea that the animal rights movement entering into climate politics is some kind of example of Trojan horse politics, where we're like hiding in the horse and then we jump out and say, ha, we've secretly made you all vegan. So actually, I'm actually justifying that we have a place, we have a very justified place within the climate justice movement, and the mainstream climate justice movement needs to listen better to what we have to say. Okay, and it's all, it's all evidence-based. Okay, in the rest of the talk then, I want to give some more detail concerning these three dimensions. So the impact of human-animal relations on the emergence of the overlapping climate and biodiversity crises, the impact of climate change on non-human animals, how the conditions for survival are already unraveling for many species, and considering the scientific evidence base for dietary transformation as one strategy for mitigating these crises. As you might have noticed with the content slide earlier, I devote pretty much the second half of the book to transformation of the food system and theorizing how that might happen. So yeah, these three elements together essentially also constitute the things we have to tell the climate justice and broader progressive movements, broader environmental movement too. Okay. So one of the things that we can do is maybe to impress upon people some issues of scale, and these may be stats that are well familiar to you. You possibly use them already. Some of them might not be so. So most greenhouse gas emissions have taken place since 1990, so since the Rio summit. And that really underlines failure, but it also underlines urgency. And I think that is one thing that is really important to us. We're all frustrated by the slow pace of change, but I think we can point to the exponential increase in greenhouse gases as telling us how urgent this situation is, and to saying to all those people who are trying to kind of slow down change or to obstruct change that really this couldn't be more urgent. So there's a lot of controversy over the percentage contribution of animal agriculture to overall greenhouse gas emissions. That's been raging for many years. In my chapter 4, I go into a really deep, detailed consideration of that and looking at the FAO and all these sorts of things, all these different sources of data. This is a non-FAO piece of research which I cite. And I'm not just citing it because it's like a little bit higher than the FAO figure, and maybe a range is a better figure to quote. But Zhu et al. 2021 basically came up with a figure of 20% of all emissions coming from animal production. You can cite that. It's probably the most reliable, highest figure. We shouldn't just automatically cite the highest figure, because we need to be wary of things like confirmation bias. But there are reasons to be a bit suspicious of the FAO work, especially the more recent FAO work, and I'll come back to that a little bit later. And obviously, yeah, as I've already said, the reduction of climate change, the climate crisis, to fossil fuels is problematic because it doesn't encapsulate everything that's causing it. We all know this figure. Agriculture uses 45% of all habitable land on the planet. 80% of that is used by animal ag, so almost 4 times the size of the United States land mass is devoted to animal agriculture, which is obscene. And other interesting stats have been produced. This is from the Meat Atlas. I'll show this in visual form on the next slide. So emissions from the top 20 meat and dairy companies exceed those of, for example, Germany. And these sorts of framing these stats in that way can be quite effective too. Emissions from the top 5 meat and dairy companies exceed those of Exxon. Okay, and just another stat which kind of tells us about scale and yeah, and all the work that needs to be done. Global meat production rose 9% between 2015 and 2021, while dairy production increased. I'm going to have to read that. In that time, over almost the same time period, 2015 to 2022, and this is another huge part of the problem, financiers provided the world's top 55 industrial livestock companies with average annual credit injections of $77 billion. Yeah. Okay. So this just gives that, this is taken from the Meat Atlas, and this gives some visual form to the size of emissions from meat and milk farms, and compared to the emissions that are coming from some nation states and some fossil fuel companies. So yeah, I recommend the Meat Atlas. It's full of useful data. And this, again, is just a visual form from that stat site, which probably you all know, our World in Data, in terms of the land use issue, which basically is a way of understanding how over the last few centuries capitalism has transformed nature, has produced nature according to its own profit desires. And that's why we have a land mass of about 4 times the size of the US being devoted to animal agriculture. This one has now become very familiar. We all know about the biodiversity crisis and the effect on wildlife and the kind of warped proportions in terms of domesticated farmed animals. Okay, so this is a table that I've got in chapter 4 of the book, and this is where I'm doing the detailed dive on the FAO work around the proportion of emissions from animal agriculture. So this is probably a little bit dazzling in terms of numbers and columns and so forth, but it's got basically the first vertical column is livestock's long shadow, which I'm sure you're all familiar with. And you can see if you read the bottom column horizontally, you can see how the FAO estimate has declined over time. And what has also happened in that time is influence from the meat industry on the FAO. So I've become increasingly suspicious, and it's been backed up by some journalistic investigations of the FAO, which seem to suggest there's been a bit of capture taking place, or indeed some might say a lot of capture, where there was a strong reaction against the livestock's long shadow in 2006. And the FAO then created a public-private partnership, which took in lots of interests from the meat industry into their process of calculating the emissions data. So I think they've kind of brought themselves into sort of disrepute, really, in terms of the trustworthiness of their endeavors, which I think is really disappointing. Okay, you can ask me about that later, because there's obviously a lot more detail in that I'm talking about now. And then we see things like, more recently, the FAO coming up with like plans to try to meet greenhouse gas targets, but omitting meat-eating reduction from their plan moving forward, which again, made the media headlines. Okay, amazingly, I seem to be doing okay for time. Right, so another thing I do, this is basically chapter 3 of the book, where I have submersed myself in all the work by conservation biologists over the last couple of decades where they've been charting the impacts of climate change on non-human animals. And I do this, it's not just focused on wild animals. I've also got some attention in the chapter on companion animals and other captive animals too. And I've come up with this list of different ways, environmental or physiological impacts that climate change is happening, and this table just also shows some example species affected, certainly not all the species affected by any means. And a lot of these things will be quite familiar to you, but I think it's kind of useful for activists to have this in a table to kind of understand the breadth of impacts that are taking place, and some of them aren't as obvious as others. So the fact, for example, that some animals are declining in body size as a response to the changing climate, I think might surprise some people, in that some animals, in this case the pink salmon, is genetically adapting itself in the face of climate change. We've all heard about most of the other things, I think, in terms of temperature changes, wildfires, floods, and so on. And you'll notice if you've got really good eyesight that I've got humans in those as well, because I'm trying to make the point that we're sharing, to an extent, we're sharing this impact with other species, and of course we are animals too. Okay, so I've now got about 8 slides, which I'm not even going to read out, but I'll just leave up for a moment. You can read it yourself if you want. Some of these things will be quite familiar to you. I was also taking care in the chapter not just to focus on charismatic megafauna, like I wanted to even think about microorganisms and insects, obviously, so did my best to kind of come up with quite a broad overview in that chapter 3. So if you get a little bit annoyed that I move the slide on and you've not read it all, then just contact me and I can send you the PowerPoint, but it'll save me a bit of time. Okay, so yeah, shifting ranges is a key impact. Obviously rising land temperatures having a big impact on reptiles. Rising sea levels already having an impact, but predicted to have a greater impact in the future. So we've already seen one mammal become extinct because of rising sea levels, the bramblecane melamus. Okay, permafrost melt in terms of methanogens and impacts upon bird life and so on, impact upon human life too. Okay, the second one obviously relates to positive feedback loops, which are particularly scary in terms of potential speeding up of emissions. Okay, drought, precipitation decline, danger of biomic shift. When you read about the rainforest being under threat and drying out and becoming savanna, then that is an example of that, or desertification is another example of biomic shift as well. And those just give a couple of examples of human-animal conflict and how climate change interacts with that too. Okay. Right, I'll move on a bit. Wildfires. So the cover picture on my book is of the so-called Australian Black Summer of 2019-2020. There's an explanation of that photo on my website if you want to read more about it. Okay. Floods, a little focus on England where I live. Okay. Okay, hurricanes too. Aquatic life, which can't escape these particular changes. I don't know about research on eels, talking about the previous talk, but I'm wondering if some of these things could be affecting eel numbers too, as well as just direct overfishing. Okay, so that's summary table, and hopefully that's of use to people. Okay, and then another thing I do, again, I think, in chapter 4, so I come up with 3 databases of articles, of peer-reviewed two of them are peer-reviewed scientific articles. The other one I'll come to in a moment. And the first one is 50 key journal articles recommending reductions in animal consumption for climate mitigation and other co-benefits, such as human health, but other things too. And that's just the first page of that database. So, and that is from 2003 to 2022. And I think that's like a really powerful evidence base. It's from top peer-reviewed journals. It's not, obviously it's not saying vegan transition, it's a reducitarian discourse, but at least I think that is still useful to us. Actually, if it was pushing it a bit further, it would actually, as we know, result in greater mitigation of greenhouse gases. The second database is a little bit different. It's actually reports rather than peer-reviewed articles, but it's also ones which are arguing for reductions in animal consumption, for climate mitigation and other co-benefits, slightly different year range. And these are from NGOs, from UK government advisory bodies, and United Nations bodies. So it's interesting with the UN, you get sort of conflicts between the FAO and other parts of the UN, which seem to be more pro animal consumption reduction. Okay. So again, that's 50 key reports. And then the third one is 21 studies demonstrating that a plant-based diet can be the lowest emissions diet. And these were published between 2009 and last year. So I think those are particularly valuable, and that wasn't me cherry picking. I couldn't find an article that argued that a meat-based diet can be the lowest emissions diet, although somebody out there might be trying to produce one. Okay, thank you for the 2-minute card. Second half of the book, I also kind of return to theorizing the animal industrial complex. I realize that's probably hard to read, but this again is part of my ongoing sort of theoretical attempts to come up with something useful for activism, to get our head around all the different institutions within society that come into play when it comes to, in this case, the animal ag dimension of the animal industrial complex. As we understand that idea in critical animal studies, it's much broader, so it includes all areas of animal exploitation, but I tend to focus most on animal ag. Okay, so let me just quickly finish off with a couple of slides. So what do we offer the climate justice movement? A specific targeted critique of anthropocentric ideology as constitutive of the climate crisis, a non-denial of the way in which human-animal relations are prominent in the emergence of the crisis, its impacts and its strategies for its mitigation. Other things too, I think we also offer a valuable emotional sensitization to the lives of other species, which may be lacking in other parts of the environmental movement. We have tools and knowledge for vegan transition. We are the experts of vegan transition. A form of environmental citizenship that does not enact an exclusion of non-human animals. Other way around, what can we possibly learn from the climate justice movement? Maybe the need to make better allies with critics of capitalism, colonialism, and patriarchy generally. I think you folks are already doing that, but it's still a good thing to say. So more intersectional knowledge, and maybe from climate science and conservation science, the recognition that the climate crisis is an existential, a meta, a grand animal rights issue, and one that needs to be at the center of the animal rights movement. Okay. So, to finish, there was good sound evidence base to suggest that human-animal relations are key to the climate crisis. Most mainstream science timidly argues for reduction in animal consumption, even though an animal rights perspective would deliver a deeper mitigation of the climate biodiversity crises. These crises are partly about a crisis in anthropocentric ideology, and I believe we should take that message into the sphere of climate politics more clearly. And that the context of climate breakdown and animal exploitation overlap in capitalism, patriarchy, colonialism, and anthropocentrism provides a strong argument for each movement to in some way inhabit the other and to come closer together. So I'll almost finish there. That's how you can find me if you want to continue the conversation, or just find me after here. I'm also using this book to try to raise money for sanctuaries, so I've got about 7 copies if anybody wants, and you can mention a sanctuary to me, or you can let me pick one, but I'm going to sell those for 20 euros and try and raise all that money will go to a sanctuary. And finally, I just wanted to big up another colleague, so I thought this other new book would be of interest to all you folks. So my co-director at CFAS at Edge Hill University is Professor Claire Parkinson, and alongside Lara Herring, they have just edited this great new book, Animal Activism on and Off Screen. So if you're interested in academic discussions about animal rights media, then check out that book too. I will finish. Thank you so much for listening.
Thanks a lot for the talk, Richard. We have like around 8 minutes for questions, so quite a lot. Yes.
Thank you so much. One question really as like an academic, or that I feel like every time if I read or talk to someone who's written a book about the climate crisis or animals or the biodiversity loss, whether it's like, you know, Guy Shrubsole or Chris Packham, it's everyone's always saying that the people who read the books are the ones who already know the issue, but just maybe want to know just a little bit more, but the ones who already understand. So do you feel like with your books, you have managed to get out of that echo chamber? And if not, how do you think that can be done?
One goal of critical animal studies is also to politicize human-animal relations within the academy generally, to try to make that change. So we're all busy, we've all been busy over the last few decades challenging, say in my case, challenging sociology or whatever it might be, history, geography, politics, philosophy. So I think we've had some success in doing that, but in terms of obviously social change, yeah, I think what you identify is a massive problem. And how do you, I don't have at this moment a great answer to that question in terms of how to break that down, but it's a spot on question, and got to keep trying. And I think it's really, it's quite a powerful thing to think that critical animal studies and its offshoots, but especially critical animal studies, is the first academic field which is vegan, okay? So in history, so we're the first academics to say that part of being this field means that you will be vegan and that you will have a scholar activist identity in some shape or form. So I think that's kind of historically significant, but whether that's just taking place in this silo that other people kind of, oh, they're the animal people, we don't actually want to acknowledge that, and we'll just go on being anthropocentric ideologues. Yeah, so I don't, it's something I'm always grappling with, but I don't have the great answer yet.
Hi, yeah, hello.
Yeah, hi.
I just wanted to share something, which
Great.
is I come from the environmental movement, and I certainly totally 100% agree. There's not enough emphasis on, it's all about energy transition. There's not enough emphasis on food transition, absolutely. However, in my experience, there's a very strong core of animal rights, deep ecology, people at the very heart of these movements. However, at the same time, relating back to one of the previous talks, they're very successful at bringing in lots of other people and not being judgmental and trying to make the movement as big as possible. And certainly by making it more anthropocentric sounding, we think maybe it's more palatable. Yeah, because deep ecology is so closely related to ecofascism. So there's like a move away from that. So I just, wanted to share that.
Yeah. And I think I know because I spoke to you yesterday that you're a biologist. Yeah, and I really value that. And there's been that biological influence into critical animal studies as well. I'm thinking about somebody like Linda Burke, who is, I don't know if people here know that name, but Linda was a biologist who then became massive in women's studies and then came into, very much part of that kind of circle with Carol J. Adams around looking at those intersections between veganism and feminism. So, and thinking about somebody like Chris Packham, who's clearly coming from a biologist perspective, there are these influential people from biology that are really important. But as I said in my talk, anthropocentrism is incoherent because it's not in our interest to be anthropocentric, as evidenced by the unfolding climate crisis, because that doesn't just undermine the conditions for survival of non-human life, it undermines the conditions for our own survival and flourishing, as we all know. So I know I get the point about making messages more palatable, but I think we also need to push that critique of anthropocentrism into the center of culture. Yeah.
Another question? Do we have more? From the online, anything? Still not? Okay. All right, then I would say another applause, and thank you a lot for your talk, Richard.